Good afternoon and welcome to the Derby Rotten Scoundrels meeting. Today we are very happy to welcome Andrew Welsh-Huggins, an author from Columbus, Ohio. And he's also, he has written, I believe it's 7 Andy Hayes mysteries. And he is also, I guess your part-time job is Associated Press, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, definitely the other way around. I'm a full-time journalist.
So, Andrew, how about if you start by talking about your transition from Associated Press? I believe you covered crime for them, and then stepping into the fiction arena.
Yeah, happy to. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Before I get started, I'm going to offer one caveat. I'm in my home office, which I share with my 17-year-old cat, Frankie. And she often wants to get in on the events. So if you see me leaning over like this or this, I'm not actually falling over. I'm picking her up because she's demanding to be seen. So sorry about that. The second thing is, real quick, because I always forget to do this, I right now have dropped my email and my website into the chat. And I just want to say that if I can ever be of any use to anyone, particularly, I guess, if you had questions about, journalism or Columbus, please use me as a resource. I'm always happy to do that, and in any way I can. So again, thank you for having me. And yeah, let me tell you just a little bit about sort of my, as I like to call it, my journey to mystery writing. So I live in Columbus, Ohio, which is my adopted home, but I actually grew up in the Finger Lakes region of New York State. And I was, fortunate to grow up in with two parents who were huge readers. So we grew up in a house full of books with a lot of mysteries around. And that made a big impression on me. When I was about 8 years old, I climbed up the bookshelf and pulled out one of my mom's Earl Stanley Gardner Perry Mason paperbacks. And even though I didn't really understand much of it, that sort of helped get me going on mystery writing, because there was just something kind of thrilling about for a little kid, for those books. And so I always sort of date my interest in mysteries to that. So, growing up, going to college, always a huge reader, loved mysteries, loved books of all kind. Tried my hand at some short stories and, a couple novels that will never see the light of day. My career began as a journalist in Providence, Rhode Island, which is where we lived back in the 80s. And I started as a freelance writer when you could actually make a little bit of money, as a freelancer working for actual newspapers and weeklies. And then we moved to Bloomington, Indiana, and that's where my journalism career really took off. I worked for 7 years at the paper there in Bloomington. And the first full-time job I had at that paper was police reporter. Now, this has always puzzled me. Things have changed a little bit, but papers always would give the crime beat, police beat, to the most inexperienced reporters. That's what you did starting out. And this always puzzled me, still does, because, the obvious reason is the hours are pretty lousy. My schedule for 3 years was I would go to work at 2 p.m. and come home at 11 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday, except on Saturday I would come home at midnight. So not a great schedule for social life. But the police beat is a beat where you are encountering individuals often at their worst moment, and you're dealing with really obviously terrible situations, and you're having to pry information out of the police, which sometimes they don't want to get out. At least in those days, I was in some, those were the days when, if you knew the police officer and they trusted you, they would actually let you into the crime scene. I mean, I saw some pretty horrific things standing there as a bystander. And as a journalist, that kind of made me grow up pretty fast. So I'm really grateful for that experience. I did that for 3 years, and then I shifted to a different position at the paper covering the university, which was almost like covering a small city. There was obviously a big university like that. There's so much going on, and frankly, a lot of what I continued to write was police beat related things because there was crime on campus. So all as this is happening, I'm continuing to dabble in mystery writing, and I wrote a number of short stories about a female private eye. I never managed to publish any of them, and I think that's because I hadn't gotten my system down for the long, hard road of submitting and publishing, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But I'm a big person for systems. Sometimes I think if we have a system, that helps us get over 90% of the obstacles. So from Indiana, I moved to Ohio, or I should say back to Ohio. I had gone to college in Ohio, and that's where I met my wife, and she's from the west side of Cleveland. So we moved in the mid-90s with our 3 kids to a place called Youngstown, Ohio, a former steel powerhouse, which by then had definitely seen better days. And I did a just variety of reporting of all kinds, but again, lots of sort of true crime, criminal justice stuff as well. And, that was a very formative experience. The paper in Indiana was a small paper, very robust, but small. The Vindicator in those days, by the way, that was the name of the paper, greatest name ever, the Vindicator. So that was at the time, that was sort of a medium-sized metro with a lot going on. So great experience. I will say, sadly, to illustrate the state of journalism, that the Vindicator actually closed for good 2 years ago. And that was a total shock. And by closing, I don't mean they were bought by another chain or that, they went completely online. They literally closed. So it sort of illustrates kind of how journalism has changed. Anyway, before that unhappy event, long before it, I decided to go to work for the Associated Press, and that was in 1998. So I started with the AP in 1998 and moved to Columbus the same year with our family. We got here and we burned all our moving boxes, and that felt pretty good because it turns out we really liked Columbus. And if you're not familiar with the AP, just very briefly, everybody gets news from the AP, even if you don't realize it. We're a 150-year-old worldwide news gathering operation. I started at the AP writing, doing what most newspaper reporters would do, writing what we think of as print stories that end up in a newspaper. And I still do that, but I also now take photos and I take some video. So the AP has really diversified over the years. And just because we get this question a lot, the AP has a slightly different business model, even though we provide news content that probably you and lots of people read. Our customers are actually other media organizations. So we're what's known as a business-to-business corporation. And being at the AP has been my career. I've been there for 23 years, and I more or less expect to retire from there. So at the AP, like every place else I've been, I sort of gravitated towards criminal justice stuff. And my road into mystery writing actually started through 2 nonfiction books that I published based on reporting that I'd done for the AP. One of those, or the first, is a book called No Winners Here Tonight, which came out in 2009. And that was based on several years of reporting that I did on the death penalty in Ohio. And in 2005, I published a big series about the death penalty. Basically, it was based on an analysis I had done of the first 20 years of the capital punishment law in Ohio. And turning that into a book was what I wanted to do. I found out that that's always not as easier said than done sometimes, but it was a really interesting experience. And I'm very happy with the outcome. So that was published in 2009 with Ohio University Press. And then 2 years later, I published a book called Hatred at Home, another nonfiction book. And that was based on a domestic terrorism prosecution in the early 2000s in Columbus involving three friends. These are very common now. They're not even really headline news anymore, but back then that was huge national news when these guys were arrested. So I followed that case a lot and ended up doing kind of a soup to nuts account of that case. So then this fortuitous thing happened. Again, all this time I'm reading mysteries. I'm still trying to write some mysteries. And then Ohio University Press was suddenly looking for a new mystery series. And, I was pretty close with the director. We talked a lot, and I told her that I was working on this book with an idea as a series, and she was interested, and she asked if she could see a draft. So that was probably that was in probably March, February or March. So everybody knows right now we're in NaNoWriMo, where you write 50,000 words in November. Well, my version of that was in March of 2013, I believe, when I realized I had to finish this thing really quickly. So I finished the draft and sent it off. They liked it. They liked the concept. And that book became Fourth Down and Out, which is the first in my series about this former Ohio State quarterback in Columbus who became a private eye. And since then, I've sort of done things backwards. I've continued to write books in that series, but along the way, I kind of revived my short story career, such as it is, and I actually published my first short story after a couple of these books had come out, and that in a weird way gave me this extra boost of confidence that I belonged in this genre, because it was someone besides my own publisher providing positive feedback and giving me a sense that I belonged. So since then, my seventh Andy Hayes book came out in June. And I've also published, I've probably published between 20 and 25 short stories in the past few years. Some of them are Andy Hayes stories. Most of them are standalones with a couple of exceptions. And I try to balance both. I mean, obviously everybody here knows that when you're working on a novel, that's a tall mountain to climb, and it takes up all your energy. I have a sort of, again, back to systems. My system for writing is I typically will work on that big project Monday through Friday. And then Sundays tend to be a day where I'll sort of catch up on the, I guess I'll just say on the other stuff. And that can be anything from marketing to my newsletter to making sure my website looks okay. And then I'll often polish short stories on Sunday, or maybe I'll start one. I kind of like the break when you're in the middle of a project like that. And my one book that's a departure from the Andy Hayes series is back in 2017, I pitched doing a book called Columbus Noir. And I'm guessing most people here are familiar with the Akashic Books noir series. This is a wonderful series that they have been producing for, gosh, well over a decade now, probably close to 2 decades, where they gather guest editors and writers in different cities and sometimes states. And these are anthologies, typically stories set in different neighborhoods in a particular city. And if you're not familiar with these series, I strongly encourage you to find them. The thing I love about this series is that, of course, they have the big ones, right? You've got Manhattan noir, Brooklyn noir, Chicago noir, LA noir. You've got all those. But what really attracted me to that series was you've got things like Pittsburgh noir and Providence noir and Montana noir, which I think is actually one of the best ones. In other words, an opportunity to look at a city through the eyes of mystery writers that might not always get that attention. So anyway, I edited Columbus Noir, and I'm not sure who was talking about, Elaine, if it was you, but talking about something coming right out at the beginning of COVID. So, timing in life is everything. So Columbus Noir came out on March 3rd of 2020. We had, I literally had 2 events in person. We had the launch, which was a real nice event. And if you can think back, there was lots of like, what's going on here? But we weren't staying home yet. And then the following Saturday, I had an in-person event at a local bookstore in Columbus, and that was it. And then I went probably 14 months, like we all did, dealing with this sometimes fun, sometimes horrible thing called Zoom. So that's kind of how I got into the mystery writing, and that's sort of what I do now. Let me just talk briefly about my genre, and then I've always got a lot to say, but happy to open it up to questions. So I write in this book series. This is very much a private eye series, and I was always attracted to that, even as a kid. Way back to Encyclopedia Brown, right? That I guess he's more of an amateur sleuth, but in some ways he does get. I believe he charged 25 cents, so I guess that does make him a private eye. And, going forward, we lived in Providence, like I said, in the 1980s. And that's when Robert B. Parker was writing, his Spencer books. And I've always felt that the books that he published in the 80s and maybe early 90s, but definitely, I just felt like he was at his absolute peak as a writer. And those were just such great books. And my wife and I both absorbed those. But then I was attracted to, to plenty of other private eye writers, the classics, Dashiell Hammett and, Ross MacDonald's Lou Archer. I love John D. MacDonald's Travis McGee novels. Like a lot of books, some of those age better than others, but that the idea of that sort of outsider with a bit of a chip on his or her shoulder, trying to figure out something that the police can't, that has always appealed to me. And the thing that sort of pushed me into doing my own was there's a writer named, I'm sure everyone knows, Lauren Esselman, who writes a Detroit, well, he's written a jillion books, but he has a Detroit-based private eye series about a private eye named Amos Walker. And that's about as hard-boiled as you come. But then there was a guy named Les Roberts who wrote a really entertaining series set in Cleveland. And his private eye was named Milan Yakovich, who he famously named after his dentist. And apparently his dentist was fine with it, and it's a great name. And that series really helped me come to the realization, like, hey, Cleveland has a private eye series, and why shouldn't there be one here in Columbus? So that's it was a combination of all that reading and frankly living here long enough that I felt like this was a city that I belonged to, and I got to know the city. I think one of the things that over the years had sort of maybe held me back is that I had moved around so much that I didn't feel like I had a community that I could really call home and knew well enough and appreciated enough to base a series in. And so it took living in Columbus quite a while. I mean, frankly, if you look at the timing, I moved here in 1998, and the first Andy Hayes novel was published in 2014. So that kind of gives you a sense of the growth that I needed to go through. And then just briefly about my character, you know, we all know that our private eyes need some kind of baggage, right? They're typically like a fallen angel, a wounded warrior of some kind. And I ran through the list as I was coming up with this concept, and I thought about a military background, obviously very common. Didn't feel like I could do that justice. Same with being an ex-cop, again, very familiar. Again, it took me living in Columbus for this amount of time to realize that, oh, that's right. What's the worst thing you could do in Ohio? You could be an Ohio State football player that gets arrested the week before the Michigan game and loses the national championship and then goes to prison. You'll never be forgiven. And playing with that, I pretty quickly realized that, okay, this is perfect. He's got this huge cloud over him that even though Columbus is really growing a lot, you know, people are still going to remember that. And that's still something he's always going to try to have to deal with. And then people always ask me, well, you know, man, if he went through that, why would he even stay in Columbus? Why wouldn't he move to like Saskatchewan? And the answer to that is somewhat simple. As part of his, I think of it as his bad boy days. You know, he burned through relationships and marriages, and so when he finally emerges from this fog of bad behavior, he has two sons, each by a different ex-wife, both of whom are in Columbus. And this was my fictional way of coming up with fashioning a way for him to stay in Columbus and have a reason to be here. And if you've read any of the books, you know, his relationship with his sons ebbs and wanes and grows. And, you know, I try to keep that somewhat at the forefront because I like the idea of humanizing him a little bit. You know, the private eyes that I know, the real private eyes, and I'm sure you know the same, they have real lives. They have spouses, they have kids, they have dogs they have to let out. And even though I play around with the rigors that Andy goes through and the adventures he has and the fights and the knocks and the blows on the head he gets, you know, I like keeping him grounded a little bit. He's I get the question a lot about whether he's ever going to settle down, and I still haven't decided that after 7 books. But I like the fact that at least when it comes to his kids, he's come around to trying to be a better dad. Anyway, that's maybe I'll take a little break here and see if anybody has any questions. I've got some other notes I'd be happy to talk about in terms of mystery writing and my own process, but why don't I just be quiet for a moment?
I'm going to ask a question because I'm writing a series, and you know, Carol, who can't join us today, is writing a series. And I guess what is difficult is each new book is in its own way a standalone. Somebody might pick it up and not know anything about what was going on. How do you determine what backstory do you feed in and how much of it, so that they're caught up on the fact that, you know, Andy, you know, did this horrible thing. If for some reason somebody in Columbus didn't know that, and having lived in Columbus, everybody in Columbus knows that. But you know, how do you determine what to feed into the book, into the new book?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I think about all the time. And the short answer is I really do try to write these as standalones, which also have a place in the arc of Andy's life, if that makes sense. And so from a mechanical point of view, there's a few recurring characters that he ends up doing jobs with or encountering, and then his children. So it just from a mechanical perspective, I will, when I introduce a recurring character, what I avoid is dropping a big paragraph of background in right away, but rather what I try to do is, in a particular scene, weave in a couple sentences that lightly bring the reader up to speed, so that one of Andy's compatriots is a bail bondsman named Otto Mulligan, and whenever Otto shows up, I just have him enter the scene and have him do his things without telling anybody more than what they're reading. But after not very many sentences, I will pause and just explain who this guy is and why he's important. This is what I'm trying to do is avoid what's known as the backstory dump, which I think we're all familiar with. And I think we've all read books where you've got a good mystery, but the main character goes to coffee to meet whoever, Bill Jones, and rather than reading about the reason for that coffee, you suddenly get 3 paragraphs about Bill Jones, and that's kind of what you want to avoid. But at the same time, I need to remind people that my character has this weird past with Ohio State. And, I need to remind people sometimes that he saved the day in a particular way that has bearing on the current book. Now, sometimes this gets into the land of spoilers, right? Sometimes I'll make references in a current book to something that happened 2 books ago, and I realize that I'm actually partly giving away the plot of the previous book. So I have to be kind of careful that way. But in general, I think the key is to work on the book as a standalone. So in my case, say someone who is a person who likes private eye books will come to this, and hopefully they will enjoy the private eye nature of this book. But they'll also get just enough sort of background that it kind of catches them up on what's going on. I don't think you want to leave people guessing too much. Now, again, back to Robert Parker. He was a master of this, but I feel like he tread a pretty narrow line. If you're familiar with those books, Spencer had a partner named Hawk, and Parker had a really good way of bringing Hawk into the narrative, but sometimes I felt like I was fine with it because I'd read every book, but sometimes I realized that Parker was, he would bring Hawk in, and if you didn't know who Hawk was, you might be a little confused. And so anyway, Parker was a master, and he got away with it. But that's something. It's a delicate balance between lightly bringing people up to speed and not like bonking them over the head with background. Anyway, long answer, but
I appreciate the answer because it is something that everyone, well, not everyone, but maybe it's just me, you struggle with, because you want them to know about their background. But again, like you said, you don't need a whole chapter on, well, this is what happened before you joined us.
Right. There's no need to do that.
I don't want to be the only one asking questions. Anybody else have a question? I know you write oh, go ahead, Gloria.
I was going to say not so far.
Okay. I know you write in the first person, I think one other time I listened to you were talking about some of the best PI novels are written that way. You know, Archie Goodwin, and it comes to mind. So you made that choice.
Yeah, that actually brings up a great point, great question. So the Andy Hayes novels are all written in the first person, and the reason for that is simple. To me, that's like the classic PI trope. It's not universal, but you know, that being in that first person, being in a person's head like that, I just think that's how private eye novels are written. I just finished, well, right now I'm reading through all of Walter Mosley's Easy Rawlins novels. And if you've never read those, I strongly encourage you to read those. They're brilliant. And those are very much first person. And I just finished, the writer Steph Chaw has a really good 3-book series about a Korean American investigator in Los Angeles. Again, first person. Now, that said, I have written a number of short stories in the third person, which is a style I really enjoy as well. And in fact, I've also written a couple Andy Hayes short stories, also in the third person, which I found like a fascinating experiment to write about the same character, but not totally in his head. Now, I don't do multi-character perspective things in that. Part of me thinks that would be cheating a little bit. So when I write an Andy Hayes short story and it's set in the third person, it's still all him. Oddly, I have found that when I do those stories tend to be a little bit darker for whatever reason. I still haven't totally puzzled out why. And then my other short stories are a mix. I've written a number of short stories in the first person, and then a bunch more in the third person. I have another character whose name is Mercury Carter, and he's a freelance mailman. He delivers almost anything for a price: information, items, and sometimes even people. Now, he's only appeared in 3 short stories, and I'm kind of thinking about a book about him, but those are all third person and with some varying perspectives. So I would have a hard time seeing that going back to the first person. Anyway, I like mixing it up that way. I doubt I will ever write a Andy Hayes novel in the third person. I like mixing it up in the short stories. And I'm sure on this call, we've all had the same experience. I mean, I think it's good to just change up, you know. Sometimes a story just needs to be told in the third person, especially if you're going to have, if it's a multi-character perspective. The downside of a first person narrative, obviously, is that everything comes through the character, right? And if you're going to play fair with the reader, you have to be very careful, because there's nobody else weighing information. It's all coming through that character, and that's a challenge. The nice thing about a third person perspective, especially if you're going to have different characters' viewpoints, is it's easier to sort of parcel that information around.
You said that you have a system that you use in writing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that system?
Yeah, happy to. I'm big on systems, from cleaning the cat litter to emptying the dishwasher, to doing my writing. So I'm an early morning writer. So I'm up, quite early, trying to get a couple hours of work done each morning before I go off to my day job. Now, let me talk about my writing system, and then talk about my editing system, and then talk a little bit about submissions. So in terms of the great plotter pantser debate, I would be somewhere in between. I am not an outliner, so I find it very difficult to sit down and outline for several days. I like to sort of just jump in. But at the same time, I typically will plot a lot up here, and I tend to sort of plot ahead in my mind, usually have a good idea of where it's going. And I am a big proponent of the rocket draft, of getting, to me, the most important thing, whether it's a novel or a short story, is to get that initial draft done, so you then have something to sort of sink your teeth into and go back and start revising. So although I do try to make the first draft a really good draft, I don't loop back a lot. So typically, what I will do is I will write during that allotted period of time. Now I think we're all familiar with this. I don't write straight for 2 hours, right? Some of what I do is write. Some of what I do is sit there. Some of what I do is this. Some of what I do is Googling. But in general, and I don't concentrate on, I'm not a word count person. I tried that and ended badly. So if anything, I try to finish each day in the middle of a scene, so I feel like I have something to go back to. Anyway, I will, as I start each day, I will go back and read through and lightly edit what I wrote the day before. I think that's really important. And then when I get to the end of that, I will mark in the manuscript. I use Microsoft Word. I will mark where I started the sort of fresh writing for the day, and then I'll just proceed until my time's up, and then I'll repeat the next day. I keep a separate document on the side that I will note things as I'm going that need to be in there, and that could be characters' names, it could be plot points. But what I don't do is I do not go back in this first draft and make a big correction if something occurs to me. So my first drafts, when they're finally done, they're really not fit for human consumption. Nobody's going to see them but me. And I will give you the classic example of that. In my 6th Andy Hayes novel, which was called Fatal Judgment, I was having a hard go of it. And about halfway through, I realized that the problem was that a particular character, a police officer, I had as a man. And about halfway through, I realized I had it wrong, and that police officer needed to be a woman. And I made that change in the middle of the draft, and I just kept writing. And I didn't go back and make any changes. So if you were to pay me a whole lot of money to see that first draft, you would see this very strange thing where on pages 60 to 80, you had Officer Gary, and suddenly on pages 150, it's Officer Gloria. But the whole reason I did that, again, is my goal is to get that first draft done, and then kind of, to use a lack of a better word, then the fun begins for me. And this is my system. And I will say I use a somewhat unorthodox method to keep track of where I am. I'd be curious if anybody else does this, but whether it's a short story or a novel, I date every draft. So the Andy Hayes novel I'm working on now, I actually started back in 2019, and it got interrupted for various reasons. But that draft is called it's called number 8, because I still haven't come up with a title. Number 8 - August 27th, 2019. And when I'm finished with that, I will then, and that's a complete draft. When I go back into it, I will then create a new document dated whatever day that is. And I'm guessing that's going to be something like January 3rd, 2022. And then I will work on that draft, put it aside, and probably start another draft, which will have a new date. So if you look through my files, I mean, a lot of my books and short stories, there's as many as 10 drafts there, each with a different date. So obviously there's kind of two ways to doing this, and I don't think either is better or worse. The other way, obviously, which people do with great success, is you just work on your draft over and over and over again. You don't rename it, you don't create a new file, you just go back into it and fix stuff. And that is a time-honored tradition. It works well for people. I think I'm just, I don't know, anal retentive enough that what I like about my system is it is seeing those previous drafts in my little computer folder. It gives me a kind of confidence that I like, wow, this short story has been through 7 drafts. I feel like that means something at this point. And I try not to draft for the sake of drafting, just to impress myself. I mean, I really try to make each of these drafts mean something. And it's also a handy way of keeping track on the topic of submission. I, like everybody else, I use a Word document to track all my short stories, where they're submitted, what the result was, if it was rejected or not. But oftentimes, if I get a couple of rejections, I'll go back and look at my drafting and I'll say, I haven't looked at that. I actually haven't touched this story other than submit it for 7 months. It might be time to just take another run through it. And, almost inevitably, I'll find ways to improve it. So anyway, so I would say that's my system. Overall, that's my system for writing. Early morning, rocket draft, and then multiple drafts as I hammer it closer and closer to where I want it to be. The two things I haven't mentioned, which will be of no news to anybody. Okay, actually, we've reached that moment in the program. This is Frankie.
Hey, Frankie.
Hi, Frankie.
She just can't. She's been with me for many books. So with a short story, I will get it to a point where it is fit for human consumption, and then I will send it to my I don't have a Kindle, but I have a Kindle app on my phone, and I will send my short story, or frankly, I've done this with books, send it to my Kindle app, and then I will walk away from the computer, go into the living room, and my job then will be to read it on the Kindle, which is the closest thing. I mean, the other thing you can do is simply print it out, which is also a good thing to do. But once I feel like I've gotten it as good as I can get on the computer, I always send it to the Kindle. Now, you all know you can't make notes on a Kindle, you can't edit on a Kindle, but you can actually make notes. There's a way that you can just highlight something and then pop up a note box and put it in there what you think it should be. And wow, that works miracles every time I do that. I think it's that function of looking at something like you're actually reading a book or a magazine, as opposed to like this stuff. Just that change in perspective. I always catch mistakes. I always catch misspellings. And then once that's done, I'll go back, make those changes, and then it goes to my wife, Pam, who's my first reader and great reader. She does what all great readers should do, which is tell you no. And she'll point out things that work, point out things that don't work, and then I will go back and make those changes. By now, with a short story, I could be up to 6 or 7 drafts, and it might actually be time to think about finding a place to submit it. I don't like to rush short stories or novels, frankly, unless I'm on deadline for a competition or an anthology or something. And occasionally I will get a story to a place where I think it's really good, and then I'll just put it aside for a month and just use that discipline of staying away from it to go back in when the flames have died down in my imagination and take another run through it. And inevitably I find ways to fix it. And then at that point, it feels like I'm ready to send it out.
I have a question. When you're writing fiction, do you find that your journalism background enhances your writing ability, or is it more like you have to change gears and put on a different hat?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. And the answer really is both in this way. What I've gotten from journalism, frankly, is that ability to just get it done, right on deadline. I have never in 33 years had writer's block.
Wow.
Because I, as I like to say, you never hear of a plumber getting plumber's block or a banker getting banker's block, right? I mean, the number one cure for writer's block in my life has been the mortgage and the expenses of life, right? And now, have I had what I like to call challenging writing days? Sure. Yeah. Sometimes you sit down, your brain's foggy, you're tired. But because in my day job, I have to produce, that's come over into my personal writing. This just has to get done. And both from a perspective of just wanting to write stories, but I'm guessing everyone here has written on deadline, say for an anthology deadline or a short story writing contest. Now, in terms of the other question, there are some ways that the writing I do in journalism affects my fiction writing for sure. I think it's helped me pay attention to, using strong verbs, taking away as many adverbs and adjectives as possible, cleaning all that out. All those apply to fiction and nonfiction. At the same time, though, when you're writing fiction, it is very different. And that's the point where I do feel like I have to put on a different hat. And, simple things like, you've got to be thinking 5 plot points ahead in your mind. When you're writing a scene, you have to be thinking about, well, how is this thing that this person's saying going to affect this secret that I'm trying to keep hidden in 2 chapters from now and 5 chapters from now? And, you don't have to do that in journalism. I mean, journalism is about telling the facts of a story correctly. And you have to find those facts, and sometimes they're hidden, but they are facts. They're things that exist. Whereas, fiction, we can make it all up within reason. And, but that's its own challenge, right? And so I try not to take too much for granted. People ask me that all the time. Well, it must be pretty easy. I mean, you're a writer by profession, so isn't it just easy to write the fiction? I'd say no. I would never take that for granted. Writing a good short story, just writing a strong fictional sentence is a different skill. And I've had to learn that skill as I've gone, just like I learned journalism skills. And I try not to take either of those for granted.
When you say you write multiple drafts and you start, you've dated and everything, when you start a new draft, is it with a blank page or do you modify the previous draft?
Oh, yeah, no, good question. So what I do is I literally, in Word, I will just so I'll do a save as. Mm-hmm. So if I have, so whatever, short story, first draft, June 1st, 2020. The next draft will be June 23rd, 2020. And it will start out as the same exact story. and then I just go through and change. Now, one advantage of this is, you know, you don't have to worry about like, wow, I need to get rid of these 3 paragraphs, but what if I need them later? Well, with my system, you've got them, right? They're in the previous draft. So that's, you know, I used to have like, I called it like a leftovers file where I would stick all that stuff, but then I realized I never really went back to it. So, and, you know, by the way, I should also say in this drafting system of mine, I more or less take the same approach in that as I'm drafting, you know, I'll take my time. Now I'm really trying to make this the best thing it can be. But again, unless I'm on like this super serious deadline, if I get to page 190 of the draft, let's say the second draft, and I realize like, oh yeah, the dog needs to be yellow, not red, I will simply note that in my other document and I'll just keep going. I don't go back and try to fix that. I always have a list of things going that need to be fixed in the next draft. And the reason for this basically is I'm kind of all about forward motion. I just think I think we need to like just keep going. And you know, I don't know if you know this phrase, but I'm actually kind of a brusher. Like I just like to brush my copy again and again and again, like you're brushing your hair until there's not a single tangle in it. And I find it most effective to just keep going, but then note the next time where you're going to have to fix stuff. Now, obviously that changes maybe at the very end, or if you're on deadline and you've got to fix all this stuff, or if your editor is saying, here's 7 changes I need by Tuesday. But in general, I just think it's better to just keep going.
You say that you do light editing every day before you start writing. What is an example of light editing, and what is your system for editing at all?
Yeah, good question. Well, the light editing can be everything from, this happened the other day. I realized I'd used the word tidbit in this twice in the same paragraph. And there is nothing that drives me crazier than when I repeat words and phrases. And I know I do it. And I've actually created an entire paragraph that continues to grow of repetitive phrases that I'm prone to. I think we're all in the same boat, right? Glanced, started, shrugged, plus. I mean, there's a million of them.
Grab.
What was that? Grab.
You
Yeah.
read a book, everybody grabs.
Grabs.
It's
Yeah.
the one that drives me nuts.
So the light editing could include everything from that to basically just improving a scene. You know, I was working on a scene the other day taking place in a laundromat where Andy's helping his bail bondsman buddy. And when I wrote that scene, I kind of had the concept in my mind of what I wanted to happen there. But 24 hours later, I'd had enough time to think about it. And I realized that, oh, okay, since you're going to be editing that, this is a better way to do that. So, you know, sometimes when I'm doing this next day light editing, sometimes I can actually rewrite an entire scene.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fair game to me because it's part of my system. And my system involves writing, going back the next day and editing what I wrote before I move ahead. That's fair game in my mind for making those kind of changes. So I think as I've done more, I think I've gotten a little bit better at writing something on Wednesday that doesn't need a lot of changes on Thursday, but you know, we can always still revise and find ways to say things better.
And your system period for editing is what?
Oh, well, it's when I'm going back to to do the big edits on a novel, this is where that side document comes in handy that I mentioned before. So, you know, I'll familiarize myself with my characters. I will look at different plot points and different research points that I've noted and make sure those are in there. I like when I'm doing these final, well, as I go, I like to keep chapter length pretty uniform. So that's something I might, you know, my chapters tend to be around 2,000 words. I think that's like a really good sweet spot. And as I'm editing, I might be reading something and think, wow, this is just like going on forever. And I'll look and I realize, well, that's because the chapter is 5,000 words. So I'll literally break it up and do what I have to do to, you know, have maybe 2 or 3 chapters out of that, and make sure that the chapters are ending with something that gives the reader a reason to go ahead. Yeah. And so yeah, the editing involves that stuff. It involves, you know, when I'm done with something and I'm pretty close to submitting it, I'll actually try to reserve a couple of days to, first of all, spell check the whole thing. Even though Word is a very powerful spell checker now, as you go, I always go back and spell check. I always now go back and I run this list of repetitive words through and see how many of those I've got. I've actually started a new technique, which is, I'm sure there's easier ways to do this, but I realized recently that if you completely spell check a Word document, and then if you paste that document into an open email on Gmail, Gmail actually has a different word processing, a different spell checking program. And holy cow, I'm finding like 4 or 5 things that I didn't catch on Word. I mean, it's really helped me a lot. So that's like an extra step. But I always just like to encourage people, when you're kind of ready to submit that thing, you know, really give yourself however long it's going to take, a day, to rigorously spell check for repetitive words, you know, do that whole process. That I'm sometimes amazed when I hear people tell me they don't spell check because, you know, well, it does it for me as I write. Trust me, the practice of spell checking a document can yield huge benefits. Sometimes because it'll land on a word for whatever reason, and it'll jar something in your mind, and you'll think, there's actually something off about this scene. And part of that is just that practice of the intentionality of stepping back from the document and doing something besides writing that will help you kind of think about some final changes to make.
All those points are excellent. I'm going back and thinking of all those little pieces and stuff that I've put and pasted somewhere else. Like you said, I'll probably never use them again. But I like the idea of dating and going forward with that, other than trying to figure out, well, where was I the last time I visited this piece? That's excellent, excellent. I have a question about your editor, because I'm an editor. So do you have like a specific editor you work with, or is it someone with your publisher, or?
Yeah, so first of all, editors, I love editors. A good editor does what a good first reader does. They tell you no. And so on the Andy Hayes novels with Ohio University Press, so the short answer is, I haven't hired an editor or anything. I do have my wife, who's my first reader. I typically will have a beta reader or two. There's a couple retired police officers that I know who will very kindly read my copy. And even though these are private eye books, there's a lot of police procedure in there, and they'll always make great suggestions. But the way it works at Ohio University Press, I think, is somewhat similar, even though it's a tiny press. once I turn a manuscript in, I will get developmental notes back. In the broadest sense, here's what I think works. Here's something I don't like. Here's a change I really think we need to make. And those aren't necessarily granular. They can be 7 bullet points in an email. And, you know, we've all gotten those. We've all felt that pit in our stomach. And the only thing you can do is just say, sounds good, and dig in. And every writer goes through these, even some of the most accomplished writers out there. And then the second set of, so that will happen. And then the second set of edits I go through are the, then a different editor will do a line edit. And at the same time, the manuscript will be copy edited. So the line edit that's a much closer read. They're not necessarily looking for huge plot points, but they might, this is someone who might be catching discrepancies in what's happened, as well as, you know, the classic, okay, so Andy gets in this car and drives here on Tuesday, but then the next scene, it's Monday. So you need to fix that. And then copy editing is periods, exclamation. Well, actually, I'm anti exclamation point, so I try not to use any of them. But you know, making sure the grammar and and if there's any spelling things I've missed. And then the last, so that's part 2. Part 3 is the galleys. So back to me to read through the galleys and to catch any final little things. I always find that the most stressful, because at that point, you know, the galleys look like a book and this is your last shot. If you miss something now, it's going to be a mistake in the book. And I mean, that's happened. I in one of my books, I had Andy turning right on a street in Columbus to go west, but that actually was making him go east. So sometimes it's going to happen. I mean, you may have all heard the story, you know, the writer P.D. James.
Yes.
You know, I think it was her first book. She had someone on a motorcycle backing up in an alley. So motorcycles don't back up. And for 30 years, she got letters from people informing her of this, even though she was well aware of it a month after that first book had been published. Sometimes you just can't win.
Any other questions? Well, let me say I really enjoyed this and learned an awful lot. And I may be emailing you about other questions.
Please do. Everyone, please use me as a resource. If there's anything I can do, especially with, you know, what would a reporter do in a scene like this or whatever, you know, I'm happy to help. Sometimes we're always trying to get it right when it comes to what a cop would do. But unfortunately, I've read a lot of stuff with reporters in it, and I'm like, wow, that would never happen. So always happy to help with that.
Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you at Prime Crime.
Yes, that would be great.
And somewhere else down the line, maybe in Columbus, because it's not that far. So, but I appreciate you spending your Saturday afternoon with us. Thank you very much.
Great to be with everyone.
Thank you very
much.
Wonderful.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very informative.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.